But first, let's turn our attention to what happened in Israel just a couple of days ago. Many of us have said for quite some time, if we're talking in a purely functional, legal, ethical, and moral sense, Israel is an apartheid state with regards to the occupation of the West Bank, which very closely mirrors what we saw in South Africa, the occupation, the siege on Gaza, which is actually a very different thing, and in some respects, more autonomous than what you would see in apartheid, and then also far worse because it's literally a ring of presence that does not allow people in Gaza to function in any way outside of the open-air prison that Israel has control over and, of course, is governed in absolutely a repressive and abusive way by Hamas. This legislation that was passed last week and deals with Israel within 67 borders, where Israeli politicians could make the case in some limited respects that in 67 borders, Israel was a sort of preferential democracy, but still a democracy. Well, this law, statehood law, has come into place, and that throws that into profound doubt. We're going to set the table. This is a piece, a report from Al Jazeera that goes over the reaction to the bill from Arab and Palestinian lawmakers and some of what's actually in this legislation.
As Israel's capital, Stefanie Decker has more from West Jerusalem.
It's official. Israel is a state exclusively for Jews. That's the essence of the controversial nation-state bill passed by the Knesset on Thursday. After hours of heated debate, the measure became law by a vote of 62 to 55, with 2 abstentions. For years, the language of the bill divided political opinion between the ruling parties and the opposition. Arab members of the Knesset say the law legalizes discrimination.
This is a bill from a government that is an enemy to Palestinians. It's the most dangerous measure. It's a law from a racist government against Palestinian rights, and it creates an apartheid regime. It turns Israel into a fascist state.
The most controversial clause in the bill, a provision calling for Jewish-only communities, was replaced at the last minute. The original legislation would have allowed the state to establish separate communities on the basis of religion and nationality. The replacement provision says, the state sees developing Jewish settlement as a national interest and will take steps to encourage, advance and implement this interest.
And of course, Israel's far-right government is made up of a coalition which includes parties that support settlers in the West Bank and parties explicitly dedicated to the West Bank settler colonial project. And as we know, and as I touched on before, Israel was already an apartheid state in a very broad sense of the term because of the 67 borders, an occupation that has been ongoing since the 67 war. This is the legal definition of apartheid: a deliberate and systemic act of racial discrimination with the purpose of maintaining unlawful structures of domination by one race over another. We see this in everywhere from separate bus lines, IDF soldiers backing settlers in violence against Palestinian civilians. We see this in the reality that Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank are not autonomous actors and are controlled by an outside force who, in the case of West Bank, restricts their movements and freedom behind an iron cage and security wall, and in Gaza blocks them from food, medicine, participation in a global economy, and regularly kills civilians in Gaza in a reckless and wanton fashion, which we see on a regular basis. So that is the reality of Israel. And it's also a reality now that in its sort of very painful and striking variant is really giving the sort of final death throes of a liberal Zionist perspective. And I'm agnostic about this, in the sense that, was there a historical injustice in the founding of the State of Israel going back to the 1940s, which, as a matter of course, meant that hundreds of thousands of Palestinians lost their homes? Absolutely. It's a foundational injustice. And it's, of course, also a foundational reality that Jewish people fled genocide, Holocaust, and persecution from Europe. And this was the political reality and the reality of the founding of Israel. If you had a point where there was an actual two-state solution with two full, clear, autonomous states, and provisions for Palestinian refugees, including going back to an independent Palestinian state or going back to Israel, and financial compensation and other resources, that might have been the workable political solution. And that, by the way, was never fully put on the table, not by Ehud Barak, whose proposal would have only been about 95% of occupied territories and would still not allow for an autonomous Palestinian state in terms of doing things like controlling its own airspace. Ehud Olmert came a lot closer, but still some of the same problems remained. And of course, even as he was doing that, he was implementing, on the verge of implementing Cast Lead, which was a major humanitarian series of crimes against Palestinians in Gaza. So we're at a point today where, regardless of where you come from with it, if you value equality, fraternity, anti-religious supremacy of any sort, and you do not believe in identitarian politics at the expense of the human rights for all, you need to be in the struggle for a nonviolent, fully democratized resolution to this process. Not only is the world turning in the opposite direction, in fact, we could see that Israel's unapologetic racialized ethno-state was actually not just the sort of exceptional case which the United States supported in all conditions and the Europeans had an ambivalent but supportive relationship to, in some cases because of their obvious hideous history towards the Jewish people, specifically in Germany's case, obviously, but in many other European cases. We can actually see now that the far-right ethno-nationalist fusion of hyper-capital and white identity politics in Israel, because of course this also not only applies to Palestinians, this also applies to Jewish people who might be from Ethiopia, as an example. Not this bill specifically, but other efforts to deport people and moves by the Israeli right. We could see that this move, this strategy, was the precursor of a resurgent far-right politics in all Western countries, so that the fascist heirs of the same people that persecuted the Jewish people in France and Germany and elsewhere, that are now running rampant over Europe, but this time on a program of Muslim bigotry, they reached out to Israel quite some time ago because they saw an analogy there. And it's the same reason that the ever-punchable Richard Spencer endorsed this legislation. And it's also the same reason why you'll see some of the worst people on earth showing up on your YouTube feed trying to lie about the legacy of the liberation struggle of South Africa, which is something that we're going to have to be covering much more extensively and will be on this show. But if you care about real values, you care about dignity, justice, and freedom from violence for all, then you have to be supportive of a clear, just, and equitable solution for all in Israel-Palestine.